You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 12th of September 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up, the US piles on the sanctions against Iran.
The growing cooperation between Russia and Iran threatens European security and demonstrates how Iran's destabilizing influence reaches far beyond the Middle East.
We'll examine what Washington could achieve by punishing Tehran for supplying arms to Russia. Also coming up, a controversial bill reforming the judiciary passes in Mexico, to the fury of thousands. We'll ask what the new laws will mean for impartiality and justice. And with tanks, frigates and F-35s, the Netherlands plans to bolster its military hardware on a grand scale. Plus the papers, and we find out more about Milan Design Week's ambitious new plans. That's all ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in today's news. The UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees has accused Israel of killing 6 of its workers in an airstrike on a school in Gaza. There have been violent protests in the Argentinian capital, Buenos Aires, after the country's politicians voted to block a planned raise in the state pension. And Peru's former president, Alberto Fujimori, who was convicted of human rights abuses and corruption, has died aged 86. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, the US has taken action against Iran after discovering that Tehran has been supplying Russia with ballistic missiles to use in its war against Ukraine. Russia has received ballistic missiles from Iran, and the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said Washington had privately warned Iran that providing ballistic missiles would be a dramatic escalation. Well, I'm joined now by Negin Shiraghaei, who's a former presenter at the BBC's Persian service. A very warm welcome back to Monocle Radio. Good morning, Negin.
Good morning, Emma.
Now, this is a comparatively recent shipment, isn't it? It's not yet been used against, these missiles haven't yet been used against Ukrainians.
Yes, they're predicting that it would be used in a couple of weeks. But from what we are reading in the news, it's obvious that the intelligence came in, for a while now, and they've been trying to understand what exactly is happening. And this is not the first time Iran has been supplying Russia with, army artilleries during the Ukrainian war. We know Russia has been using Iran's Shahed drones as well as the Mohajer drones, Mohajer 6 drones in the war. But this is a apparent escalation from what was happening before. These missiles, the fat ones, have the long range, kind of like 120 kilometers range, which threatens the Ukrainian and the Europe as well. And that's why the escalation from the sanction side of the Western government we are seeing that is happening right now.
Indeed. So it is actually the nature of the missiles that are being supplied which has led this to cross a line.
I think that's a major factor, but as well as there was a feeling that the Western government was hoping for a while now, since the beginning of the Ukrainian war, that Iran would not, side with Russia and in that obvious way for a while. We know there has been negotiations between the Western governments and the government in Iran, especially because Iran, at the beginning of the Ukrainian war, Iran was in a really vulnerable situation. The uprising in Iran happened, women life freedom, the government on the brink of collapse. And then there was a time that they didn't have, economic-wise, they were under a lot of pressure. And they managed to control that at the beginning of the Ukrainian war. And it was a feeling that the Western government were hoping that they could convince Iran not to meddle, not to supply Russia, and not to side with Russia in that war. But during the last year and a half, we've seen a lot of changes. Slowly, Iranian government showing that they would sign up with Russian side of the war. And this is not the first time they've been doing this. They've been collaborating with Russians throughout the past 2 decades. They've been supplying them and doing military maneuvers in even Latin America, in different places around the world. Usually the government in Iran is supplying the low-cost kind of army, either missiles, drones, things that the Russia wouldn't produce it itself. It's too expensive for Russia to produce it. For Iran, it makes sense to produce it, and in return for that, ask for the backing of Russia in the international scene, as well as using other artilleries from the Russian arsenal in a long term.
Is it just a simple military advantage that Tehran stands to gain by supplying Russia and engaging in this kind of deepening of relations? But is there a wider sense of the benefits that Iran sees by deepening ties with Russia?
But for me, it goes with the Islamic Republic's mindset overall of this kind of escalating its influence in different parts of the world with the help of Russia. This is a pattern that they've been repeating over and over again over the years. Wherever Iran, although other countries don't see it that way, or not that many people, it has this kind of colonialistic mindset that they should interfere in politics in different parts of the world. It's part of the ideology of Islamic Republic to expand its influence in different parts of the world. And throughout years, they realized they can rely on Russia more than any other country to help them to do that. Provide them with opportunities, provide them with the financial support, as well as the kind of a backing internationally to be able to do that. Every step of the way, the Western government has been blocking them. And we know that from the Bosnian War to now, that this has been going on for a while. And I think more important than anything else, any military side to it, is that mindset that is driving Iran to side with Russia. And the only thing we would see is that alliance tightening over the years.
So just explain now, Negin, the nature of these sanctions which are now being imposed, not just by the United States, but it's France, Germany and Britain as well are also taking action in certain areas. What is the nature of the sanctions and the intention behind them?
The sanctions are, parts of it are not new. For example, the sanction on Iran Air, it happened before when the UN imposed sanctions on Iran Air. So that included, the government, US and the European government as well for a while, because Iran was using it to supply military support to the Bashar Assad government, as well as going around the sanctions imposed by the UN for a while. And that went away with Iran's nuclear deal, but then it came back again now. From the Iranian sources, we know Iran has been using its own national airline to supply armed and military staff in different parts of the world. So it wasn't a surprise. It was something that, one of the first steps that they would have done in terms of going back to putting more pressure on Iran after, the nuclear deal. But I'm not sure, how effective they can be in the long term. They are effective in the short term in the sense that they would kind of send a signal. But in reality, Islamic Republic has become really good at going around the sanctions and kind of maintaining its grasp on the military side of it, although the sanction existed for a long time. So we have to wait and see if Iran is actually will suffer from it.
So with this question mark hanging over the actual effectiveness of these sanctions, is there a concern perhaps that continuing sanctions from the West could actually embolden Iran and indeed embolden the US's foes?
I don't think it would embolden Iran. I think Iran has a mindset in mind, or Islamic Republic has a mindset in mind, and it would follow that map whatever happens. It had nothing to do with how many sanctions are imposed or not imposed. And we've heard that, like even before this election, the now president of Iran, Masoud Pezeshkian, came out and said whatever he would do, he would follow the supreme leader. And I think to understand the Iranian mindset, you need to understand the mindset of the supreme leader and his cronies around him. And that means the sanctions are seen as a part of, a struggle along the way to achieve that bigger goal of expanding Iran, Islamic Republic's influence in the rest of the world. And it doesn't wither them from following the path.
And indeed, as you've mentioned before, Iran says it is, it may well be able to circumvent or manage without or within the further restrictions that these sanctions place. Is there a sense that the sanctions regime, it is, we go back to that age-old question about how effective that they really will be?
It's a good question, but at the same time, you need these steps. So you don't go to outright war with a country. There's as an international community, I don't see that many ways for the politicians to send a signal to the Islamic Republic that they should stop. They are, they would have an sting. They're painful for the Islamic Republic because they have to go around this. And it means that they have to pay money to different dealers along the way to be able to carry something from one place to another. That means it costs more for them and they're losing money. But so it scales down their operations. But at the same time, it doesn't vanish it completely. So it all makes sense in a larger picture that what is the end game? Do you want to go to a war with a country, or do you want to use other methods to kind of contain them in a manner? And I think the Western government managed to contain Islamic Republic in a manner with the sanctions over the past couple of decades. But yeah, I don't know how effective in that end goal is that to stop them from thinking and wanting to follow the path of expanding their influence.
Negin Shiraghaei, thank you so much, as ever, for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist. 12:12 in Mexico City, 7:12 a.m. here in London. Now, protesters have stormed Mexico's Congress in response to the passing of a controversial law to reform the country's judiciary. Plans to make all judges stand for election have prompted widespread demonstrations. Some people are fearing that one of the last remaining checks on the president's powers will be compromised as a result of this law. Well, I'm joined now by Pablo Calderon Martinez, who's Associate Professor in Politics and International Relations at Northeastern University in London. Welcome back, Pablo. Good morning to you.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So these scenes of violence, they were they were so intense, they forced the suspension of proceedings, didn't they?
Yeah, there were some protesters that managed to make their way through the debate in the Senate, and it managed to hold proceedings for a little while. Eventually, the law, the reform, did manage to pass by just one vote. But yeah, there were some interesting scenes, and yeah, something that we've seen for the last few weeks, really, when it became evident that the government, the party in government, had enough votes to pass through these controversial reforms.
Just explain to us these controversial reforms. Remind us what's in this law.
Well, basically, I mean, there's several issues, and the idea is to transform the judiciary in Mexico, which, as many things with this government, I think the diagnosis is correct. There is issues with the judiciary in Mexico, and there's been for many years, decades probably. But again, the solution is probably what is more controversial. Everybody agrees that there is an issue with the judiciary in Mexico, but basically the solution the official party is putting forward is to solve this by electing judges at pretty much every single level, and the creation of a new sort of legislature oversight for the judiciary as well, which is also going to be elected directly by the people. And even the Supreme Court judges are going to be elected directly by the people. And there is a reduction as well in the number of judges in the Supreme Court from 11 to 9. So the idea basically is that now there's going to be a politicization of the judiciary because of this direct election of judges at every single level. And that's really what is really controversial about the reform. Other aspects like lowering the number of Supreme Court judges from 11 to 9, and maybe the creation of an oversight body for the judiciary are slightly less controversial. But it certainly is the direct election of judges that is becoming really problematic here.
This is the problem, isn't it? This directed election of judges that you refer to there. And as you say, the fears are that it politicizes the judicial branch. It places the election in the hands of the people. And as a result, it could threaten the democratic process. However, EMLO has been said that actually this will remove corruption and it will make it easier to punish and remove judges. So who's right here?
I mean, as ever, who knows, right? I mean, we have to wait and see. Yes, it could politicize the judiciary to some extent, but the reality as well is that the judiciary is always heavily politicized, right? Particularly at the higher levels. When you look at the Supreme Court in Mexico, not only in Mexico, if you look at the United States, for example, you pretty much know which way a particular judge is going to go based on their politics on any given issue. And judges are picked and chosen by presidents or Congress or whatever it may be because of the political stance. So this idea that somehow the Supreme Court is now going to be heavily politicized, well, it's already heavily politicized. So to some extent, I would say, you are simply acknowledging something that's already happening. The courts are politicized. That happens in Mexico and other places. I think it's more controversial at the lower levels as well, because obviously, you know, the idea is how do you maintain oversight in the electoral process, particularly at the lower level of judges, and it happens the same in all sorts of politics. So I think that's really the issue. Will this strengthen the judiciary or make it more transparent and more accountable? I don't know. The reality is only time will tell. I think it's a big, big gamble. It's a risk. I do think that there needed to be reform of the judiciary. I don't know if I necessarily think this is the best way forward, but I suppose at least we are trying to do something.
And this risk has been spotted not just domestically but internationally, hasn't it? Because we've seen the peso weakening in the last couple of months. And also we've had the US and Canada, Mexico's huge trading partners, saying that this actually could undermine their trade pact and could undermine investment.
Yeah, I mean, as we know, obviously, what investors like and what, the markets like, stability, they don't particularly react well to change, any sort of sudden change like this. So there is a little bit of uncertainty, again, particularly with their commercial relationship with the United States and Canada. As we know, the North American trade agreement that regulates trade between the three countries has to be renegotiated, has to be revised, rather, in the next few years. So this creates a little bit of uncertainty. So it may create troubles. But again, it really does depend on what happens on the ground. And I think as well, one of the things that plays possibly to the advantage of this reform is that it's going to happen rather quickly. And I think that's probably a good thing because you really want these things not to linger in the background for too long. So by 2027, really, we should have already elected judges in place. And then that should either, cure us or kill us in a way, right? So this is either should prove that the reform is working or at least it's not that bad, or it will really prove that it's really, really bad. So, at least it's going to happen quickly.
It's going to happen quickly, but it's also going to create an immediate headache for the incoming President, Claudia Sheinbaum, isn't it? She takes office on the 2nd of October. This is part of Andrés Manuel López Obrador's sort of like legacy as president. He wanted to push this through before he left at the end of the month. What he is doing is creating this big problem for his successor.
I think Claudia Sheinbaum, to be fair, I think she's very much supportive of the reform. She has been very vocal supporting it. And I think this would have happened perhaps one way or another. And it just seemed unavoidable for this to happen once Morena got the majority in Congress and Senate. And they were very, very close to the absolute majority in the Senate. They were just shy a couple of votes. So I think once the result of the election was known, it was known that this was going to happen either way. And at the end of the day, I suppose everybody knew that this reform was on the cards before the election. The electorate chose to give Morena a huge majority, a big majority. And, I suppose the assumption here is the people knew this was coming. The people voted for this. So to some extent, you have to respect the popular will and the democratic will. And this was a sizable majority from Morena as well. It's not like something like Brexit where it was like 1% here or there. This was a sizable majority from Morena. They gave Morena the capacity to push through this reform. Claudia Sheinbaum supports it. All of Morena supports it. At the end of the day, I suppose, I would imagine, most Mexicans support it as well. So it has to happen.
Pablo Calderon Martinez, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. Still to come on today's programme, why Albania is hosting a summit to give Afghan women a voice. Stay with us on The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
Let's continue now with today's newspapers. I'm delighted to say that joining me in the studio is Claudine Fry, partner at Control Risks and a regular voice around the microphone here. A very warm welcome back, Claudine. How's life with you?
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very well, thank you.
Good to have you with us. Right. OK, what have you spotted?
So there is, of course, absolutely chock-a-block coverage of the US election at the moment in all the papers around the world. So it's good to remind ourselves that there are other things happening, of course. I've picked a few different things, one of which is from Le Monde about the French authorities now that the Olympics and Paralympics are over, reporting that they did successfully thwart 3 terrorist plots to attack both the Olympic and the Paralympic Games in Paris and other cities, and that those plots were targeted at Israeli institutions and representatives of Israel, not actually the team itself, apparently, the Israeli team. So I think that's just a really sort of sober reminder that, you know, we were all relieved that the Olympics passed off peacefully, but that is partly as a result of an absolutely enormous security operation that was underway.
And it was something that actually had dampened the spirit pre-Olympics, that when you spoke to people in Paris before the Games began, everyone said, we're really worried about terrorism, because Paris has suffered in the last decade with terrorism, with the attacks on the Bataclan and you know, and so forth. It is under constant threat. And when you think about the scale of the events taking place in the heart of the city, it is actually sort of testament to an incredibly good job done by the authorities.
That's right. And I think we don't very often take the time to acknowledge that. Of course, we also did have the cancellation of the Taylor Swift concerts in Vienna this summer, also because of the nature of the terrorism threat in Europe at the moment. And again, that was a success, really, by the intelligence services. So we can have some confidence there, but we should still be mindful of what is a very serious threat.
But also, it sort of plays into context the fact that actually, we have thankfully not had a major terrorist attack in recent years here in Europe. It appears that things are working, but the threats from various quarters are increasing and are ever present, aren't they?
Yeah, that's right, Emma. Of course, at the same time as we've had far less mass casualty attacks being successfully carried out, there is a whole host of sort of lone wolves or different individuals motivated by a range of different ideological, religious, political grievances that are carrying out incidents or plotting incidents. We've seen a huge amount of knife crime, particularly in Europe over the summer. And so, and also gender-based violence. And of course, there's a lot of debate about what even constitutes terrorism these days.
And what's interesting is, we know when you're working at Control Risks, I mean, do people sort of slightly forget the nature of the ever-present threat of terrorism when they're factoring in financial risk?
Yeah, definitely. It's one that's very easily sidelined. And so we are definitely constantly reminding people not to let it drift off the radar.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Let's have a look at an article in the Korea Times, which is about the Czech Prime Minister, confident that its nuclear power deal will overcome legal hurdles.
Yeah, that's right. I picked this one out because nuclear energy is going to become an increasingly topical issue. It's emerging very, very rapidly as an increasingly important source of energy around the world. The UK alone, where we're sitting here today, is planning to increase the amount of nuclear energy generation capacity 4 times over by 2050. It's a clean energy, and so it's a solution to energy transition issues, but also as part of efforts by states around the world to improve their energy security as well. And it's also a really good example of the way that middle powers like South Korea are playing an increasingly interesting role on the global stage. So here we have the Czech government looking for organisations, for companies to build a nuclear power plant, and the Korea Hydro Nuclear Power Company has been selected as the preferred bidder. But this has angered companies from the United States, Westinghouse Electric, and from France, EDF, both of which are very established long-term players in the nuclear industry, who have questioned aspects of the way that the South Korean company has been declared the preferred bidder.
Indeed, it's an intellectual property issue that's causing the headaches.
That's right. And there are some questions around the nature of the principles that have applied in the decision making. But this is an area of intense competition between established and emerging powers in the nuclear energy world.
Let's move to a story that you spotted in the Financial Times about the Saudis and dress code. I mean, in context, the byword, isn't it, is modesty. Yet Saudi Arabia is opening itself up in a way that is not only enacting breathtaking international change, but it's the speed at which it's doing it. And it's having to find this meeting point, isn't it, between accepting that international cultures and international visitors are going to bring their own style and their own cultures to what until now has been quite a closed culture in Saudi Arabia.
That's right. I mean, I made my first trip to Saudi Arabia earlier this year, and it was really interesting because, first of all, everyone you ask about what to wear gives a different answer, and generally, no one really knows. It's a very uncertain time because the change is happening so exceptionally rapidly. And then when you arrive, you do see a variety of types of dress on foreign nationals. Some people are dressing as they would anywhere in the West, and other people are still dressing in a much more conservative manner. So I picked this piece because it's an interesting indication of the fact that it's not straightforward. It's a comment piece in the FT that refers to the fact that apparently the authorities have actually moved to tighten up expectations and requirements and obligations around the types of dress that local nationals are wearing, particularly government officials. And it's a reminder that that Saudi Arabia is going through an absolutely phenomenally rapid modernisation, but actually there's a balance to be struck as it proceeds along that path.
And you have, is it a generational one or a financial interest or what? Because there's one article in one part of the Financial Times where we have a sociologist talking on fans at football matches to dress formally in order to protect national identity. I mean, in many other countries, that would be seen as a rather difficult, challenging request to make of anybody. But the fact remains is that people do see that adherence to tradition, which is actually incredibly important still.
That's right. I think this is about identity, values, but Saudi Arabia is a very, very young country. Its population is extremely leaning towards people under the age of 30 who may be growing up with very different ideas about how they want to dress.
And the interesting part is that, when you're visiting there and they're trying to open the huge coastal part of Saudi Arabia as being, the next international sunbathing destination, the requirements are still that, that women dress incredibly modestly. Not much suntanning going on, let's be honest with this. And the idea that the visitors will go there, I mean, how much is there a risk, perhaps, that by promoting what appears to be an incredibly open and rapidly changing culture, that perhaps there will inevitably be that very difficult diplomatic moment when someone who is from a different culture oversteps the mark.
That's right. And of course, we've seen lots of international sports stars taking very lucrative contracts to go and play their sports in Saudi Arabia, but oftentimes they're not necessarily their families, their partners are not necessarily living in the country. And I think that may reflect some concerns about the kinds of restrictions that they'd be living with. So I think at the same time, Saudi Arabia might want to make itself distinct from some other countries in the region which have opened up and been very relaxed about the way, comparatively relaxed about the way that foreign nationals behave. So they'll seek to forge their own path. But yes, it's going to be tricky.
Claudine Fry, thank you so much, as ever, for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist, where the time here in London is 7:30 a.m. A quick summary of some of today's other news headlines. The UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees has accused Israel of killing 6 of its workers in an airstrike on a school in Gaza. UNRWA says it is the highest death toll among their staff in a single incident. Israel says it carried out a precision strike on terrorists planning attacks from within the school. There have been violent protests in the Argentinian capital Buenos Aires after the country's politicians voted to block a planned raise in the state pension. The country's right-wing president Javier Milei said an increase would put the country's economic security at risk. The Chamber of Deputies had voted 153 in favour of the pension hike, with 87 against it, falling short of the two-thirds majority needed to approve the bill. Albania's main opposition leader says he's been indicted on corruption charges for actions he took when he was Prime Minister. Sali Berisha described the indictment as a political vendetta. Prosecutors have accused him of using his influence as Prime Minister in a privatisation process in order to help his son-in-law. And Peru's former president Alberto Fujimori, who was convicted of human rights abuses and corruption, has died aged 86. Fujimori governed Peru between 1990 and 2000 before he was forced from office amid allegations of corruption. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Just nudging 8:32 in Amsterdam, 7:32 a.m. here in London. Now, the Netherlands Armed Forces are to be given a huge uplift, with orders being placed for new tanks, new ships and new F-35 fighter jets. The major investment comes just 10 years after the country sold its entire fleet of tanks to Finland, and is almost a doubling of the size of its defence budget in just 2 years. Well, to tell us more, I'm joined now from Amsterdam by Stefan de Vries, who's European Affairs correspondent for Euronews and BNR News Radio. A very good morning, Stefan.
Good morning to you.
Good to have you with us. May we assume that Russia is the reason behind this?
Yes, absolutely. 10 years ago, as you just mentioned, the Dutch sold over 100 Leopard tanks. They had a quite formidable tank battalions to Finland because at that time the reasoning was that the war would probably be a new world wars would probably take place in cyberspace or would be highly automated, so there will be no need for old-fashioned material like tanks. So the Netherlands sold all its tanks, and now indeed, of course, the global security situation has profoundly changed. So the Dutch have made a U-turn and announced earlier this week, that they will buy 50 new Leopard tanks, so they can reinstate a new tank battalion. So it is history that takes its course, and it changes the doctrine of the Dutch army.
Indeed. I mean, so let's explore a little bit of the redressing of the balance here, because the Dutch defence minister has said that deterrence only works if we are credible. Was there a sense that the Netherlands had in fact lost their credibility a little bit?
Yes, in a way, absolutely. Of course, the Dutch defence forces are relatively small. The country is small. However, the Netherlands plays a very important strategic role in NATO because of its geographical position. The country has one of the largest ports in the world, Rotterdam, another port in Vlissingen, both very important ports for logistics, for material coming from the US, for instance, in case of a war. So it also also harbors nuclear weapons. So it has a very important position in NATO. But over the last 10, 15 years, there have been huge budget cuts in defense. That was also, of course, also a result of history, you can say, in a way, because at the end of the Cold War, we thought we had won the Cold War. We could divest. That's also something, see, for instance, in Sweden, where the island of Gotland was very heavily militarized during the Cold War, an island in the Baltic Sea. Then, like 5-6 years ago, the Swedes decided to sell all of their material on that island, and now they're reinvesting again. So it's something you see in other European countries as well. A very long time, we thought we were safe, that we could invest less in defense, and now, of course, reality has changed, and you can see that reflected in the choices of the budgets of many European countries.
And we now, let's go, focusing back on the Netherlands, we now have the Leopard tanks coming in, 50 of them. Yes. There is a sense of irony, isn't there? Because the former Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, who was behind the very budget cuts that led to the original sort of supply of tanks to be sent to Finland, is now going to be NATO Secretary General.
Yes, absolutely. It was under his first government, actually, that the government decided to sell all the tanks to Finland, much to the happiness of Finland. They were very pleased with the Dutch tanks. And then the Prime Minister was Mark Rutte in 2011. Now he will be replacing Jens Stoltenberg in only 3 weeks from now as the new Secretary General of the NATO. And he's probably pleased with the decision the new government has made in his absence. It's more or less they correct the mistake that Mark Rutte made. But it didn't influence his nomination in Brussels as the new NATO chief. But yes, it is in a way ironic.
And what's been the reaction to this? Because actually to almost double the size of your defence budget in just 2 years is clearly going to make quite an impact on the country's overall political budget, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. There's actually quite a general agreement on the fact that the defense spending has to be increased. The Dutch will probably hit the 2% budget this year, so 2% of the national GDP. That's a NATO norm that countries should spend according to the NATO to the defense. With this new announcement, the budget will increase another 10%. So it has now a budget of almost more than 21 billion euros a year. It will get an additional 2.4 billion. So the defense forces will get much more money. But actually, the money is never really the problem in the Netherlands. The biggest problem, not so much equipment either. You can order anything you like, but it is personnel. Defense in the Netherlands has the greatest difficulties in recruiting and retaining people. That's basically something you've seen in the whole of Dutch society. Almost all companies, businesses, government institutions, they are not able to find any people. So you can spend a lot of money, but if you don't have the personnel to man the equipment, to man all the tanks, then the question is your force stronger, or is it just nice material that is shining on a parking garage? That's of course a very challenging problem the Dutch are facing now.
Stefan de Vries, thank you so much as ever for joining us on Monocle Radio. It's 8:38 in Tirana, 7:38 a.m. here in London. Now, more than 130 Afghan women have gathered in Albania at an All Afghan Women summit. It's an effort to develop a united voice representing the women and rights of Afghanistan, while the governing Taliban seem hell-bent on silencing them. Well, joining me now is Lynne O'Donnell, columnist for Foreign Policy magazine. Good to have you back. Good morning, Lynne.
Hi, Emma.
Thank you for joining us. Tell us who's at this meeting, please.
There's around about, as you said, more than 130 women who've come from all over the world, even from Afghanistan. A lot of the women are involved in women's rights activities. Many of them are simply Afghan women trying to make a living outside the country, now living in exile. And those who've managed to leave the country to come to Albania and have done so with male escorts, work inside either secretly or overtly for women's rights and the welfare of women inside Afghanistan. Many who tried to leave to travel to Albania for this conference were not allowed to exit the country, and those who have done, of them, many have been able to leave Afghanistan with the mandatory male escort that the Taliban now lay down as law.
So there is quite a fair amount of risk that these women are taking.
Oh, absolutely. Just being a woman in Afghanistan these days is to take risk. What they want to do is come together and form a consensus around the issues that women in the country have been facing since the Taliban took over 3 years ago. And as you are no doubt aware, the strictures on women's lives just keep getting worse and worse. The walls are narrowing, and just in the last couple of weeks, the Taliban have issued new rules for women's conduct, which include them not being allowed to sing or recite poetry in public, which essentially means that they are disappearing. The Taliban are disappearing women from the landscape of life inside Afghanistan.
Tell us a little bit more, therefore, what this meeting intends to achieve, other than to shine a spotlight on a problem which is, as you say, worsening.
What they would like is for there to be an awareness amongst governments and other organisations outside Afghanistan of just how horrific life is for Afghan women. And they also are seeking the codification of the term gender apartheid, so that it becomes a crime against humanity. And even though it sounds jargonistic, it is something that organisations like the International Criminal Court, for instance, and the United Nations would be able to pick up and write into international law as a crime against humanity. It's essentially the persecution of a particular gender, in their case women, as state policy, which is what it is in Afghanistan. They're also determined that the Taliban will not be recognised as the legitimate government of Afghanistan. At the moment, the Taliban have no such diplomatic recognition, but there is tacit recognition by countries like China and Russia, Iran, Turkey, a host of others. And so they are able to claim tacit recognition, even though they don't have it officially, and this gives them more strength to go on and introduce the laws that they are doing. And they want to have a recognition that what's happening to women in Afghanistan could very easily impact the lives of women outside of Afghanistan. I was in Pakistan for a couple of months over the summer, and that's certainly very easily visible that what's happening in Afghanistan is not staying in Afghanistan. And we could even point, Emma, to what's happening in the United States. The physical autonomy and reproductive autonomy of women is now an election issue. So in my view, for what it's worth, when you normalise the extremes of any behaviour, you make it even more difficult for normal behaviour, what we accept as normal behaviour, to remain unchallenged at any level.
Tell us a little bit more about the role of those immediate neighbouring countries that you talked about. Just to explain a little bit more in detail about what is happening to women in the likes of Pakistan, which you visited a couple of weeks ago, given the fact that there has been that call and that sometimes that role played by neighbouring countries to offer safe haven to women, or to actually to be critical of the Taliban.
Yeah, I think the being critical of the Taliban is really just, especially in Pakistan's, in Pakistan is. It's just about terrorism. What Pakistan did was for 20 years support the Taliban and give safe haven to the Taliban leadership inside Pakistan, so that the insurgency against the US and Western supported government of the Republic could go on. And when the Taliban effectively won, Pakistan thought that they would have huge influence over the conduct of the Taliban administration. And the Taliban have shown themselves to be what very many people warned of and knew was coming, as basically a terrorist regime. The same figures who are blacklisted as terrorists by the United Nations Security Council and who were in power more than 20 years ago are back in power, and they are now sponsoring and harbouring about 24 jihadist and Islamist terrorist organisations. And one of those, the TTP, the Pakistani Taliban, is now waging war against Pakistan. It's an existential threat to the Pakistani state. And in regions of Pakistan where this war is ongoing and which I have visited, the same fears exist. The Taliban are coming in, they're taking over, they're killing people who are associated with the government, women who go to school, they're torching girls' schools, killing women who are in their own businesses. It's the same sort of reign of terror that now exists in Afghanistan. The Taliban are the Taliban no matter where they are. The Chinese government has had an association with the Taliban for about 30 years and is now exploiting that to sign contracts for access to minerals and oil and gas, of which Afghanistan has an awful lot. Iran needs Afghanistan and therefore now the Taliban because it has drought problems and needs access to water resources. The Central Asian states are in Russia's purview, and Russia recognises the Taliban tacitly and has Taliban diplomats in the embassy in Moscow, basically as a foil and against US power. So this is what we see going on. It's an Islamization of an entire region of the world, and women are the biggest, but not the only, by a long stretch, victims of that.
Lynne O'Donnell, thank you for joining us on The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Time now to get a roundup of all the news from the Middle East. Journalist Ruth Michelson joins me on the line now from Istanbul. Good morning, Ruth. How's Istanbul looking today?
Istanbul is sunny, but I feel like every time I start one of these segments with that, I'm sort of rubbing it in. So we can move on to the news.
It's fine. It's fine. We're used to it by now. Let's talk about, we mentioned in the headlines, UNRWA have said that the highest number of their employees have been killed in a single incident in Gaza. They're saying that the Israelis targeted a school. Tell us more about that.
Yes, so this is making headlines in both the National, the outlet based in the Emirates, and also gets mentioned in the New York Times that UNRWA has said overnight that 6 of their staff members were killed in 2 airstrikes that hit a school in central Gaza on Wednesday. They have said this was the highest death toll among its staff in a single incident since the war in Gaza started. Also mentioning that this particular school has been hit 5 times since the start of the war and has been sheltering around 12,000 displaced people. The New York Times mentioning that this strike happened at the same time as there was an increase in military raids, Israeli military raids, and also an airstrike in the West Bank cities of Tulkarm and Tubas, and that this increased activity that we're seeing in the West Bank is coming under scrutiny because of the killing of an American Turkish activist there last Friday, who was reportedly shot in the head while at a protest. Lots of reporting and reactions because Joe Biden and also Vice President Kamala Harris both came out and made quite extensive statements about Aisha Shiraghaei and the shooting that, in the words of Joe Biden, led to her death, which he called totally unacceptable yesterday. Kamala Harris saying that this was a horrific tragedy, but as is pointed out by Al Jazeera, she stopped, or Harris and many other US officials have stopped short of calling for an independent investigation into this incident.
Let's stay with the continuing theme of the complicated relationship between Washington and parts of the Middle East. The State Department has granted millions in military aid to Egypt, and there have been concerns from several rights groups about a decision to waive concerns about the treatment, about human rights abuses or alleged human rights abuses in Egypt in order to get the money out.
Exactly. So this is a share of the annual $1.3 billion that the United States gives to Egypt. Specifically, what we're talking about is about $320 million. And in a statement from Antony Blinken, US Secretary of State, last night, essentially what he and the State Department have said is that Egypt should be able to access this specific $320 million, which is normally waived or has, at least since 2020, been regularly waived because of the deteriorating human rights situation in Egypt, including detaining political prisoners, just to make just one example. And they also mention the harassment and intimidation of American citizens. And essentially, the State Department and Blinken have claimed that somehow the US has made progress on this issue. But as the Washington Post points out, as Al Jazeera points out, nowhere in the statement did the State Department really provide evidence as to how Egypt has improved in these areas, because that would be quite difficult, as all evidence points to backsliding rather than progress.
Let's move to Jordan, where a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood that's among Jordan's opposition party has won a hefty number of seats in elections.
Yes, so there's been a rise in the Islamic Action Front managed to score about 31 out of the 138 seats in the Jordanian parliament. This is, according to Al Jazeera, considered a historic victory. But I mean, what we're seeing from the kind of the interpretation in the reporting coming through in reporting from the National, which points out turnout in this election was 32%, so that doesn't suggest huge confidence in the powers of this parliament. An extensive reporting in the New York Times saying that basically the Jordanian parliament doesn't have a lot of power over foreign policy, which is controlled by the king. But at the same time, there are a lot of people that turned out to vote for the opposition with the idea that recent reforms to the electoral system would allow some sort of very long evolution that could eventually result in the parliament playing a real role in shaping foreign policy, even though structurally that seems very unlikely to happen.
Finally, Ruth, if you wouldn't mind squeezing this into less than a minute, who is Abdul?
Lots of questions. If you believe Donald Trump, it's a random man called Abdul who is somehow the leader of the Taliban. But if you look at the reactions in the media, including from the National, the New Republic, or the Hill, who say it's not clear who Trump was referring to, and the National basically saying that despite him referring to Abdul as a strong man and a smart man, that doesn't actually refer to the name of any of the leaders of the Taliban, as Trump said, and perhaps he confuses Muslim names or cannot remember the full name of the current leader of the Taliban.
Ruth Michelson, thank you so much for joining us, as ever, on the line from Istanbul. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Finally, Milan's Design Week may have wrapped up less than 6 months ago, but planning for the 2025 edition is already in full swing. Alcova, the platform for new and emerging design talent, which has become Fuorisalone's hottest ticket, has held an intimate event in Milan. Did so on Tuesday night, attended by Monocle's Ed Stocker, Monocle's Europe editor-at-large. And I'm delighted to say you join us this morning, but not from Milan. You're going to tell us where you are.
Starts with an M as well, but I'm actually in Marrakesh this morning, Emma.
Excellent, that's lovely. So let's do Milan in a moment and Marrakesh first. What takes you to that completely bananas but marvellous city? It's
beautiful, sunny morning here. I'm here for our next issue, our entrepreneurs issue. So I am reporting on a rug company called Benny Rugs that's founded by a couple of Americans who've basically come here, set up shop. One of them is living here full time, and they've employed a load of amazing weavers. So I'm after this. In fact, I'm off to go and visit their HQ.
Excellent. Well, we should look forward to reading about that in future issues of Monocle. But let's go back to the other end, back to M and Alcova. Just explain a little bit about what Alcova is.
Sure. So basically, Emma, as you may know, there's kind of two parts to Milan's Design Week. You have Salone del Mobile, which is the trade show proper, which is in a trade hall. It's where the industry goes. And then you have all the stuff that's grown around it, which is morphed into Fuorisalone, outside Salone, which is also called Milan Design Week, which are a load of events that take place in the city centre of Milan, basically. And one of these things that's grown up is called Alcova, which is, as you said in the intro, it gives a platform to new and emerging design talent, perhaps some of which doesn't get shown at the trade show itself. And the thing that's super interesting about Alcova is it's always chosen these really interesting destinations. A couple of years ago, it was at a former abattoir that's about to be developed into this whole new thing, but it's this abandoned shell of a building, and often nature's growing up in it. You might have trees from these long abandoned places, nature's retaking them over. There was a former military hospital. And last year, they went outside of town and showed these amazing design works in two villas in Varedo. And on Tuesday night, and the founders were quite surprised themselves. They announced much earlier than they normally do the two destinations for what will be next year's Alcova in April, of course, of 2025.
And what are these destinations?
Well, I thought you might ask me that after I set you up there. Exactly. So we have one is a former Sneer factory. Sneer is the name. They used to make some synthetic fibers, and it was a sort of industrial titan. It was built in the 1920s. We're told it's this incredible, and I've seen pictures, but I haven't been there yet. We're told it's this incredible rationalist building with these sort of curves and lots of glass, kind of greenhousey in feel, and it's due to be redeveloped at some point. So this is a chance sort of to get in there before that. And the other one is called the Pazzino glass houses. This is a huge set of glass houses, again, sort of overtaken by nature. So there's a sort of mirroring, really. Both have this sort of greenhouse glassy theme, if you like. And the the greenhouses rather, used to be the biggest white orchid cultivation in Europe. And the interesting thing beyond all of that is also the fact that these are also in Varedo, which is outside the city limits. They've decided to return to just outside Milan. They saw these two places basically at this year's event and just, said it would have been stupid not to return having these two jewels available. And, even the fact that it's actually slightly outside Milan didn't stop the numbers. There were like 90 or 100,000 people visited in April this year during the week. So people are just lapping up, loving Alcova. And it'll be interesting to see, of course, the reaction to next year.
We've only got 30 seconds, Ed, but I mean, how much does Alcova bring to this whole thing, given the fact that you just mentioned that this immense imaginative style that it has?
Yeah, I think it's, talking about Varedo, this used to be this huge industrial area, a lot of furniture manufacturing. There still is some, but it's much less than it used to be. I think it's really interesting the way it gets people out exploring these different sides to the Milan, the city, but also to, I guess, just outside the city. And it's a fascinating window into an architecture and design past.
Ed Stocker, thank you as ever for joining us on the line from Marrakesh. That's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to our producers Angelica Jobson, Tom Webb and Monica Lillis, our researcher is Sana Jumani and our studio manager Lily Austin, and the warmest of thanks to all my guests as well. After the headlines, more music on the way. The briefing's live at midday here in London. I'll be back with the briefing and with the Globalist again at the same time tomorrow. I hope you can join me for those programmes if you can. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.